Welcome to the Blockbusters and Birdwalks podcast. I am the curator, Garrett Chaffin-Quiray. Today we feature a conversation.
Hi all, this is Tom Long, functioning idiot who's been lucky enough to work in comic books since 1995.
What was your early experience with Superman 2?
As I recall, I wanted to see it and my parents were willing to take me, and so we drove to the theater and the line was literally out the door so long that they said nope. So I don't recall when I actually got to see it the first time. I think we maybe went back, months later.
That seems really resonant to me because I can also recall the around the block lines. I, however, had parents who were like, "We're going to stick it out, man." Do you have a quick thumbnail you can offer about the basic story just so we know what we're talking about?
Superman 2, as a sequel to the first movie, is really about introducing a comparable nemesis. Because in 1, he was just up against humans, but in 2, he's up against the criminals of his planet, who were trapped into the Phantom Realm. And, General Zod and his cronies come to Earth and then decide they want to run the planet. And that creates, a new level of conflict for Superman that he's never faced before.
And what I'd forgotten about, this is, me being a kid, I wasn't tuned into the romantic elements of Clark and Lois and what their whole thing is. But in rewatching it to prepare for our conversation, I was, I misremembered, but fundamental to Superman 2 is that he accepts that Lois has pieced together that Clark and Superman are the same person. He confesses his love for her and gives up his powers, which creates extra super jeopardy because these three baddies from his home world are there, and he's the only thing standing in the way of humanity's destruction, or rather domination. Let's start with the romance. What is your feeling about the chemistry and the experience of watching Lois Lane as played by Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve as Clark Kent Superman? Do you buy them?
That's been a part of the lore for a long time. If you think back to the 50s TV series, there was this, this tension, this romance, because basically Lois Lane is the ultimate Superman groupie because she has access that no other person on the planet does. And because he's her coworker, it's weird in today's society when we talk about office romance and how, complex they are and oftentimes inappropriate. He was swooning over her as Clark Kent, and then she was swooning over him as Superman. So it's almost like they created their own weird love triangle in a way.
I do remember that being a shocking innovation to my childhood memory back in the early 80s, that he could have this split personality of how he faces the world. I hadn't yet caught on to the way that every one of us has masks we wear depending on the social circumstances in which we appear. There's you at the workplace, you at home, you being the disciplined parent, you being the child of disciplined parents, and so on and so on. But there it is, dramatized as part of the arc of this movie. And the dramatic irony, that's one of those fun words I didn't know as a kid, but now I really feel to. We know something that she doesn't. You silly fool. Why don't you just recognize that as soon as he pulls his glasses off, he's as beautiful as the other guy? But that's sort of the trick of the movie. Do you like Margot Kidder in the role, or do you have mixed feelings about her?
Oh, I thought she was excellent. I thought she did a great job. She was kooky in that, Lois Lane, this, gung-ho reporter, who couldn't spell. I thought it was fun, because it was her characterization was that it was her drive that made her successful, not necessarily her skill set. They do that whole thing about, I'm drinking my orange juice so I don't get sick, as she's, sucking down cigarette after cigarette. It was this hilarious, product of its time juxtaposition.
And very famously, Lois Lane has one of those jobs that women could do before they were married and expected to be wives. And that was be a writer, one of those soft skills where you're putting together words to tell stories. It's not firm man stuff like science and engineering might be. It doesn't require that set of skills. That's composed against Clark, i.e. Superman, who's, musculature and strength incarnate. I found it this is from a 2024 position. She is asked to spout a bunch of really stupid lines. And I felt bad for her because it's cartoon cutout. And of course, because we're talking about comic book movies, that's all of a piece. She is like just reciting the panel script that would go across a page of a comic book, and she's doing it with seriousness, which I credit her as a performer. I guess that's the reason why I'm needling you about what you felt about Margot Kidder. I don't know that I buy her from today's position, but I know that when she was making this movie in the late 70s, there was a way she had to play to type, and she had to take it seriously.
I gotta admit, your disguise is nearly perfect. You had me fooled. And I am nobody's fool, believe me.
It was the 80s. Comic books were around and everybody was reading them. But what works in a comic book will not transfer to screen. There is so much in this movie that they tried to accomplish that the technology was not there yet, but also just the storytelling. It's like, yeah, you can have silly things happen in a comic because it's going to take place in one panel and there's going to be a narration box that explains it, and the audience can just move on and accept that as fact. But when you're watching actors perform, spout those lines, you're watching, cars crash or things happen, we're suspending our disbelief to watch it, and when it looks corny, we see it.
I was very aware watching this 1980-81 document that its effects are really not even up to the par of a second-tier TV show today. So you're having to reflect on what was possible then. And in the movie, it asks you to look at the spectacle, and it doesn't seem true somehow. Let me be even narrower or kind of more dorky. In the stakes of this movie, Zod and his cohort of 3, they show up on Earth and there's nothing to stop them. And just by simple mathematics, even though Superman's a complete badass, he couldn't possibly take on 3 versions of himself and hope to succeed. But we also know Zod wants to conquer the planet. It's a pretty big planet from where you and I sit, where we can't fly or have X-ray vision or all the things that these people are able to do. And yet much of their turf war happens like on a city street, inside of an elevator. It doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't express the scope of what's in jeopardy, because there are limits to what stunt work could do in 1978-79 when they're kind of putting this thing together. And because it's meant to be a global story about global concerns, about global dominance and a fight for who's going to be in control, yes, Superman flies to the Eiffel Tower, and yes, the baddies go across Mount Rushmore, but those are just little sight gags. Those would be single panels in a comic book, and in this movie, they just get down to fighting each other in ways that don't really hold water. At least, that's the position that I've got. Whenever there's a movie about global dominance or a huge fight for absolute control over the known universe, it has to be expressed on that scale. Here, it really just becomes 4 people doing a kind of soft shoe with blue screens.
There was knowledge at the time that they should have applied to this movie and in trying to help us. When Zod and Ursa and Nan first arrive on the moon and find the astronauts doing their thing on there, they start talking to the astronauts. There's no atmosphere on the moon, so any school kid knows that there would be no sound on the moon. And yet the producers, because they need to flesh out these characters, they just ran with it.
They're pitching directly to the 7 or 8 or 9-year-old children that we once were.
Right.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson would not tolerate this kind of business.
Exactly.
I have to tell you that I watched this on Prime, is where I rented it. I don't have a personal copy, and it's got that X-ray vision thing where they feed you trivia if your cursor goes over the wrong spot on the screen. So it was feeding me this negative trivia, just like you're describing, where this is not possible, and it was known to not be possible. That sort of cross-check to camp doesn't work, because camp requires us to accept the excesses are the point. Whereas something I remember about Superman 2, which I do believe is true, is it's trying to convey the idea of threat in a way that's emotionally realistic to the universe Superman inhabits. It's a big deal when he gives up his powers to become a mortal and live aside Lois and, make love to her memorably in their gigantic papasan bed, and then go out into the world to be her fella. So the stake is very intensely dramatized in the movie with this romantic entanglement that he's got. And so when the 3 baddies show up and there are these mistakes in the common physics of our world, it seems, as you mentioned, a kid would know the difference, and why the producers went that direction is foolish.
Well, foolish or lazy. I guess, it's easy to be critical in hindsight, but they montage the first movie so that if you didn't see it, you'll know who these characters are and what happened and how we got here. And watching that, it was a long slog. And worse, it was chronologically out of order if you watch it. He goes back in time to save Lois, and then they show him saving the kids on the bus on the bridge. So it's like, what were you really trying to convey? How great Superman is for everybody to build
You're
up?
You're right. And the menace and the surprise of that first Superman movie was that Lois dies on screen. It's I think in today's universe with MCU and the DC Comics revisited, they assume that you have to have such a body of knowledge to keep up. They just drop you in media res, which I know is alienating to the uninitiated. But to be blunt, most of us have some initiated understanding of these seemingly perennial figures like a Batman or Wonder Woman or Superman. They've been around for so very long. And you're correct. Like, you could have completely skipped the first 5 minutes of the movie and been okay.
Yeah.
Do you think Superman 2 is a better movie than Superman?
That's a good question. A lot of people like it more than the first, but no, I think I like the first one better because even with its weaknesses of, suspension of disbelief, it's a cleaner story. Superman 2 has a lot of strong points, but there's just so much wackiness, at least in the theatrical cut. I haven't seen the Donner cut, that it just makes it harder to enjoy because, like, when he rips off the shield of his costume and turns it into a giant cellophane wrapper, I mean, that was ridiculous. When he does the holograms of himself, like, that came out of nowhere. It's just like like I said, what works in a comic doesn't work here. And if you're going to create powers, you need to establish them. That was the other part that made this movie weak for me, is that, in the first movie, we see Superman from a boy growing up and learning what he's capable of. And yet in 2, we have Zod just show up, and then he monologues on the moon about, our molecular density is making us strong. But, they threw that in there to explain, like, these guys now know they're as powerful as this Superman character, even though they don't know who Superman is yet.
With your awareness of the comic book history and the comic book industry in general, is like the Phantom Zone as a concept super fleshed out in Superman? Is Zod given a giant backstory? Or is he just dropped in as a convenient villain when it's necessary to have a convenient villain?
I have a confession to make. I was never a big fan of DC characters. I was a comic book reader since a little kid, but I was more a Marvel guy. Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, the Hulk, those guys, because whenever I picked up a DC comic, as cool as those characters were, they were hard for me to get into. They were hard for me to follow. I worked for DC Comics for several years, and I worked on their books, and they're great books. There's great artists, there's great stories, but for me personally, it was hard to incorporate all that backstory and know what the powers were, what was going on, and all that. Because, and this is a problem for all comic books, is that, especially superhero stuff, is that continuity for most people matters. And when you just go around changing the history and retconning and doing things that can, blow up what we already established as, okay, this character does this because of this, well, we're going to eliminate that as part of his backstory, so now we can have this character do anything we want. It takes the fun out of it. And I know they do that partly for appealing to newer audiences, because if you're bound by history of a character, then everybody already knows it, and where more can you go on it? And I think that's partly why Man of Steel created a lot of controversy, because it's the first movie where Superman is depicted as killing someone. That was one thing I can share from my time at DC Comics, is that there was a lot of control exerted over character, editorial control exerted over what you could do with certain characters. And Superman was one of those characters that he is the golden boy. You do not do anything to make him dark, edgy. He doesn't kill, he doesn't lie, he doesn't cheat. He is the embodiment of American exceptionalism. Whereas Batman, if you read some of those comics, I mean, Batman got addicted to performance-enhancing drugs. He was willing to kill in Kingdom Come. There was all kinds of stuff you could do with Batman because he's human. Superman is not human. He's not fallible. He is perfection personified. So don't mess with that character. And yet, as time has gone on and different people have now taken the reins of editorial control, they've done more with it. But I can't say whether I think that's for the better or worse.
Generationally, I know that Marvel is a little bit later of a production company, and they really came into their powers, I want to say, in the 60s is my recollection, whereas DC Comics roots to the 30s and really comes up in the World War II years. The DC heroes and heroines, whenever they exist, tend to be associated with an entirely different American experience tied to pure archetype, like you just explained with Superman, basically being Jesus, and Batman being a kind of a fallen angel, and you could go down the line. Whereas the Marvel comics heroes and heroines and monsters and whatever else are built from a more polyglot environment where people's distinctions, differences, flaws are tied into single characters. So you can have them be complicated in a way that you probably couldn't with the archetypal DC design. And as that starts to migrate through the media, through radio serials, through television programs, through animated series that we grew up watching on Saturday mornings, to movies like Superman, Superman 2, and so on, for me, just to put a real specific thing on this, when you watch Lois and Clark wake up from betting each other, he's got lust.
It was pretty bold to have nuclear-armed terrorists at the beginning of the movie in the Eiffel Tower. I mean, given everything going on in our world in the last 20, 30 years in terms of terrorism escalating everything, that's pretty wild.
Or having like Soviets and Americans on the moon doing experiments together. And then, of course, we realize that Zod is not going to go to the Soviet Union. He wants to come to America.
No, he's going to Houston, remember?
That's right. He doesn't know that it's Earth.
The planet Houston.
Now, because Terrence Stamp embodies the role of General Zod, you got this very polished European actor who puts on airs and makes you think that he's a sophisticate, but probably he's just kind of a dummy lunk who decides he's going to go molest this world called Earth, and then here comes clear-eyed Superman to stop all the mayhem. That is in one side of the scale. On the other, though, they roll forward Lex Luthor. And I'm a Gene Hackman guy. I've always responded to him.
Oh, he's amazing.
And then he's got this hapless buddy, Ned Beatty, who's his dummy Otis. Luthor, he is supposed to be a genius, right? That's his brand. He's an ambitious sociopath, right? Not a psychopath. He doesn't want to do murder necessarily, but he does not care what you think of him, and he wants to manipulate everything to his own advantage.
He's basically the embodiment of a corporation. He's manipulating the rules and the people to get what he wants. He wants power. He wants control. If Superman is the ideal, Lex Luthor is the worst of a human can be, which is a selfish person who doesn't care about anybody else. And he's willing to manipulate anything and anyone. So when he appears in this movie, what is he willing to do? He's willing to sell out the planet to get what he wants, which in this case will be Australia.
Not a bad sellout, but it is a funny ploy. It's obvious that Zod could literally eviscerate him with his X-ray vision, or he could have Non just pull him into pieces, or Ursa could just punch through his heart, or whatever. But he's skillful enough with his charm, his smarts, his whatever, to explain what also can happen to his advantage, to bend circumstances always to his benefit. That statement you made, that he's like a corporation, I hadn't thought of it, but I think that's exactly right. And he gets away with a whole bunch of really... I was charmed by, but offended by, but then charmed again. The misogyny that he's just laying all over the place, particularly with his love interest, Eve, played by Valerie Perrine.
I like trees.
So does your average Cocker Spaniel.
Towards the end of the movie, what I caught this time around, and I knew about it in the past, but it didn't really click with me, resonate, is like when I was talking about the brains versus brawn, and the ideal human versus, the despicable one. Superman, like I said, he doesn't lie, he doesn't cheat and steal, he doesn't steal. But to defeat Zod and his cronies, what does he do? He tricks Lex Luthor by telling him a lie. So the whole end of the movie, we see Superman doing things which really go against character archetype. We don't see him kill his opponents. He lets them fall to their death. That's the only thing we can take from it, because they weren't there in Superman 3. In Superman 1, what does he do? He takes Lex Luthor to jail. Even though I'm not a fan of the whole super breath thing, when Superman, they think he's been crushed by the bus, and the citizens rise up and pick up pipes, and they're going to go after Zod and his crew. I thought that was a pretty powerful moment, because it's like these humans are weak. They know they're up against basically super destructive beings that they have really no chance of defeating, but they're so incensed that they all start marching together. And it's almost become a trope, because they did it in Spider-Man. Humanity steps up. The beings use their super breath to blow basically cars at them. And so you have this whole wave of destruction happening. I thought that was a really good effect.
When you have a very specific physical stunt like you're describing, the stakes raise almost instantly. I'm glad you mentioned how it is connected with subsequent superhero movies. I was noticing that too. This is in some respects the granddaddy movie that birthed everything afterwards, even if it's not directly from the same company, DC versus MCU and all of the rest. But you're right. Spider-Man's even on a bridge, like holding a bus with school children. Well, Superman got there first. Are there other moments that really stick out to you as quite good and high quality?
I don't know if it's high quality, but it's poignant. Is at the end of the movie, he's cleaning up the mess. He flies back the roof of the White House with the flag. That, and he says, I apologize, I was away, it won't happen again. It's like basically it's his promise to humanity that I'm going to be around and stick around and keep doing my job. He's the superhero character flying the American flag. Patriotism is all over the place in superhero comics. Even if we don't recognize it, it's there. Even though comics are not solely American. I mean, manga is crazy in Japan, and there's plenty of comics all over the world. But superheroes, that's what American comics really owned.
As I've aged, I got hip to that. But when I was a young person, I didn't notice it at all. I think it's just because I was young, innocent, in my navel, not grasping at how these images are reflecting on social norms which produce and project a cultural myth. To borrow the phrase, America, fuck yeah. I didn't realize all of that, right?
Yeah.
That became something I recognized later on as it becomes more and more overt. But even speaking now with that perception in the front of my thinking, what this movie and everything afterwards do well is promote the sheen of there being rules and that there's an authority and that good will prevail. And that simplicity really agreed with my boyhood thought about how the world works. It really disagrees with my adult thought about how the world works. And I now find these movies, and this one in particular, that was the shock of rewatching it, is it seems trite and silly and dumb, and why did anybody go for it or think it would work? Well, it's because sometimes we want reassurance in a complicated world where a lot of problems don't seem to have answers. But here's Superman. The willful infantilization that we put ourselves through is interesting on its face, but I no longer find it pleasant and reassuring. It strikes me as lame. When Superman has brought Lois out to the Fortress of Solitude and he's putting in the crystal to interact with the AI of his mother, it was very thoughtfully just dropped in, and I know that was a ooh-ah kind of a thing in 1980-81, but now these years later, I'm really struck by the prescience of it. It is the world that we're starting to build for ourselves and hope for, and Kal-El has it. Isn't that great? and that's really a sweet thing, especially when we live through the deaths of family members or friendships that end because of people's illnesses or they start to lose their mind. And these are things that are happening to us now in our middle years. It would be wonderful if you could have the photo album of best ofs and be able to revisit that perpetually. Well, Superman's got his mom right there to say, hey, listen, this is what's doing.
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
One story in the comics I'm trying to remember where he can hear what's going on all over the place, and then so he can pick and choose who he saves. And it's clearly, white Americans get saved. That's the problem of creating this singular, like you said, Jesus figure who can do anything.
He can do anything, but he can't do it all at once. Sweetly, and I think this has to do with Reeve and the general impression he gives as a performer, we don't think that he's stupid, but we don't think that he's morally complicated, so that we're willing to trust the decisions that he makes, however he gets to them, is going to be something we can believe in, and we can trust him to do the right thing. A different performer getting the part at roughly the same time, there would be a different sort of feel. And I think that's probably a real coup with these producers optioning this source from DC Comics to go on a national search to find this guy. They did a good job because he's sympathetic enough to get us on board. He's handsome enough to make us kind of want him. But then the way he behaves causes us to believe that, yeah, there is gentleness in absolute power because there it is, at least in a fictional format. And that's a nice thing.
I don't know if you were aware of this, but back in the 40s, I think it was, there was a serialized radio show for Superman. They used that radio show to expose and fight the KKK. There was an insider in the secretive KKK who was able to get, some of their things that were going on, record information basically, and then they incorporated that into the radio drama so that it would expose and embarrass them, and it worked.
Look what comic books can do, Thomas.
Do you remember Unbreakable, the M. Night
Yes.
Shyamalan? I like that movie because I think that really explains what comic books are for most people, is that they're the modern mythology. They're supposed to inspire us and give us, their escapism, but also inspiration, is make us better people, I think. It's no different than reading the Bible or reading...
And then it has the advantage of having little funny adventures and colorful characters, and if it's drawn well, good art. And as time passes, as I ingest more material, learn more stories, I am becoming of the mind that there are only so many kinds of characters, only so many kinds of stories. The question that we're involved with in the creative fields is how we combine those elements to refresh old lessons, old cautions and hazards about how we as a civilization of humans get along, because the known problems between us have been well understood for an awfully long time. So where some viewers and some readers need the story of Jesus and the disciples, others need Superman and the Justice League, and that's what helps them to understand that there are these forces of good and evil in balance with one another. Periodically one gets the edge. That even leads into our politics. It leads into our civil rivalries. It leads into our sports teams. And I know that some people who are particularly well versed in their faith traditions are always offended by this kind of a statement. I think it is ignorant of them to not acknowledge that the fandom people bring to watching a Chargers versus Raiders matchup is more intense than Protestants and Catholics in line at a barbecue stand, And the values that those rivalries and that affiliation with your in-group versus the out-group are very instructional in what the rules of our society are, what our aspirations are, and how we arrive at success and how it's defined. And to that degree, I think that Superman, whether in the comic books or in these movies, is this shining asymptote, to use a math term. We can never achieve what he has achieved, but he does light the way for maybe an approach that we should move towards. Tying that into our earlier statements, one of the things that always is a bugaboo to me about Superman or any superhero is the list of their talents increases as it becomes convenient for whatever story they're involved with. How fast can he actually fly to France in that opening sequence to stop the terrorists? Because that's thousands of miles, and he gets there in like 5 minutes of screen time. What are the limits of the physics of these capabilities? And if you define those, that becomes the rules, and then people like us would object to the rules aren't being observed properly. Just to pull it all together, when Superman 2 arrives at Superman giving up his powers, it is an existential crisis, because he is the godhead of our entire world, and he's willing to give it up for a girl. Wow, hubba hubba. But he spends the rest of the movie regretting the decision, which strikes me that this whole movie is a gigantic statement about how none of us should ever have sex.
That's quite the leap there, man. I don't know.
This is Blockbusters and Birdwalks, a conversation between Garrett Chaffin-Quiray and
Tom Long.
Boop boobity doo.